racial inequality in wealth, education, and opportunity continues. This is not justice, and certainly not reparatory. This is because from its genesis, the TRP was international appeasement under duress. Its intention was to keep the property class connected to the rest of the world and its market. Before I get into my substantives, let me address some points that were raised by the opposition. The model's design, if it is effective, involves mitigating factors to ensure implementation. By saying that the TRC was unable to ensure implementation, you admit that it is structurally faulty. Remember, the Commission is a part of the process and not the process itself. Team proposition confuses the two. The debate is about the process and not the Commission. The other point is, who is most likely to inflict pain on others are those who have never been held accountable for their initial crimes. I continue.
Point of information.
Not taken. The inclusion of amnesty in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission fundamentally undermined justice for apartheid victims. It created a gross imbalance. Perpetrators were shielded while victims were re-traumatized, undercompensated, and ultimately failed by the very system meant to acknowledge their pain. I categorically argue that amnesty as a central mandate of the TRP, as mandated by the Commission, comprised justice, left the victims cynical and their dignity wounded. The TRC promised truth, accountability, and reparations, but what victims got was truth without consequence, accountability without justice, and reparations without substance. As we would have said in Jamaica, puss in a bag. Why were victims who had already endured systematic violence asked to prove their suffering, while perpetrators were rewarded with immunity for strategic confessions? Perpetrators, once they could convince the Amnesty Committee that their actions were politically motivated, were granted full amnesty, regardless of the brutality involved. They were never required to pay restitution, symbolic or material. This imbalance is best illustrated by the case of Similane, a young woman abducted and tortured by apartheid police. Some of her abductors received amnesty. Others didn't even apply. Yet, not taken. Yet it took 36 years for her family to get legal recognition that she was presumed dead. And only after they provided irrefutable evidence. This is not justice. It's bureaucracy in the face of suffering. Even powerful figures like President de Klerk escaped full scrutiny. When summoned by the TRC, his testimony was evasive. Though found complicit in human rights abuses, he obtained a court injunction to censor parts of his testimony from the final report. Was this process a pursuit of the truth or a calculated shield for the powerful? Let us be honest, Mr. Speaker. The TRP prioritized brand South Africa over individual justice, economics over equity. Some say this trade-off was necessary, but I ask, for whose benefit? Can a country claim reconciliation if it buries the voices of its most harmed? Should peace come at the cost of truth without a consequence? Not taken at this time. Let us look at material reparations. Of the 22,000 verified victims, the TRC recommended ran 138,000 per person. The government only paid 30,000 rand once to fewer than 17,000 victims. Meanwhile, rand 1.5 billion in corporate fines from apartheid-era profiteers was never collected, let alone distributed to the victims. The state enriched itself on the backs of racial oppression, but failed to invest in repairing that damage. The TRC did not just fall short economically, it failed psychologically. One of the key indicators of an effective reparatory justice model is involving victims in the design of the model. The victims had no say in this regard. Victims who testified often suffered increased trauma, with 43% reporting greater distress even a year later, as reported in the Journal of Peace Psychology. Yet no one offered mental health assistance. Police brutality remains rampant. 5,000 complaints in 2021. Xenophobic violence and systematic racism still plague South Africa today. Why? Because core institutions like the police and judiciary were never reformed. Let us not forget that systematic reform is a key component of real reparatory justice. So I ask, was this enough? Can a nation move forward if so many of its citizens remain stuck in a past and never properly addressed? Reconciliation without justice is not healing. It is enforced silence. I thank you.
All right, so we thank again the second speaker on side proposition for her contributions to the debate. We will now transition into the second and final period of cross-examination, where once again we'll invite side opposition to field questions, 3 questions rather, to side proposition. Just a note, teams, ask questions. Remember, you're limited to 10 seconds, so cut the lead in and get straight to the question in and of itself.
Why were corporations that profited under apartheid never held accountable or required to contribute to reparations? Doesn't this suggest that the model protected power rather than redistribute it, which is the core to reparatory justice?
Was made its own recommendations, but the failings was not as a result of the TRP, but as a result of the government's failure to implement those recommendations.
In contrast to South Africa, Argentina and other countries pursued prosecutions. Why have these been considered more balanced examples of reparatory justice rather than truth and accountability with no real accountability?
South Africa had a legislative framework from which the TRC was born. Argentina did not. Hence, they sought prosecution. And from the prosecution, they never got the full truth of all that happened. The TRC was so designed to understand cause, nature, and the extent of which the atrocities took place under apartheid. Argentina, to this day, have not gotten to that point.
All right, final question.
Apartheid was as much about economic dispossession as political violence. How can a process be reparative if it fails to address land inequality and wealth concentration, issues that arise in the first place?
In a very brief answer, you cannot place a value on human experience. You cannot place a value on human life.
All right, so we thank side proposition for their questions and opposition rather for their questions, and now invite the questions from side proposition.
In your deliberations, you mentioned having a lasting redress. We'd like to ask you to place a value on that lasting redress.
To answer that convoluted question, value is perceived by human experience, which connects us to your previous response. And that value is tightly connected to how persons, the people who were affected by apartheid, how they perceive the benefits. And in several surveys, over 60% of those who participated said that they did not feel as though justice was served.
You mentioned in your earlier deliberations that the TRP achieved 4 things. You further went on to say 2 were symbolic. Yet later on you mentioned that it was completely flawed. Can you make that correlation to help us to understand?
So we noted a matrix of 48 indicators and then mentioned that South Africa's TRP only satisfied 4 of those. Now, if you want to look on a pass mark, that is only 8%. And so we can conclude just by those statistics that it was inherently or completely flawed.
Next question. Can you name any mechanism that has brought more reconciliation in similar circumstances?
In fact, we can. Sierra Leone included retributive justice as a major part of its truth and reconciliation process after the civil wars in 1991 to 2002, and that brought about many feelings of justice. It was not a slap on the wrist for the perpetrators. They were held accountable by the Sierra Leone's special court.
We thank both teams for an engaging period of cross-examination, and we will now transition into a 1-minute break to allow the teams to put the finishing touches on their reply speeches, after which we will resume with the opposition reply speaker, followed by the proposition replied speaker. That 1 minute starts now. All right, so that bell signals time. We now welcome the third speaker, the reply speaker, and side opposition. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, you know what? Yes, the TRP was effective, very effective at that. It was effective in only rescuing brand South Africa. It allowed them to keep the bulk of their markets, but at the expense of providing the foundation for real social change. The proposition said commission, 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 but they have not mentioned the other 5 flawed elements of the overall process, and this debate is about the process of reparatory justice. It did not account for legal accountability, nor did it address systemic reform. Side proposition clearly does not understand what is implied when the words reparatory and justice are joined together. They are suggesting that after all the demonstrated atrocities and unrectified atrocities of apartheid, we should all hold hands, spin 3 times, and sing Kumbaya and Ubuntu, peace. What a sin thing. We, as the opposition, are here to prove that the process as done by South Africa did not, does not, cannot be considered an effective reparatory justice model. By its design, it was not created to facilitate real reparatory justice. Did the South Africa's TRP's instant coffee approach yield results? Yes. It terminated the threat of political and economic isolation, but this is not equivalent to efficacy. It was a brutal compromise of justice for fleeting global acceptance, a disgrace, and a spit in the face of human rights everywhere. So, not accepted.
Out of order.
The United Nations condemned the South Africa's processes amnesty for truth model as inconsistent with international reparatory justice norms. Mr. Speaker, we outlined this for you clearly earlier. Did the TRP ensure both truth and legal accountability? No. Did it create a pathway for sustainable and suitable material reparations for victims? No. Did the TRP pursue the historically sound route to structural reform? No. Did the TRP establish, monitor, and evaluate a framework for measurable healing and psychological assistance? No. Did it significantly incorporate victims in designing the reparatory justice process itself? No. The South African TRP failed to achieve 44 of the 48 internationally recognized baselines of effective reparatory justice. Mr. Speaker, that means that in a global test of reparatory justice efficacy, it scores an unsatisfactory 8%. And the proposition wants us to believe that 8% is an indicator of success worthy of being replicated? Seriously? Are you for real? This is what is worthy of replication. Sierra Leone's process of reparatory justice scores 72% on the international matrix. Rwanda scores 64%, Germany 53%, and guess what? All those countries with successful reparatory justice models have categorically rejected South Africa's TRP as worthy of being replicated. They have all cherry-picked aspects of the model and discarded amnesty. None accepted it as it is, underscoring its fundamental ineffectiveness. South Africa has not moved significantly away from the turmoil that it was in 30 years ago. Mr. Speaker, political and economic power are hallmarks of reparatory justice achievement, and just yesterday, CNN reported that the black South Africans who make up 80% of the country's population own only 4% of private property, and less than 1% of this amount is arable or business land. Therefore, the TRP failed, and it failed miserably on one of its core points. Let us conclude on this matter, Mr. Speaker. The South African reparatory justice approach lacked adequate victim participation in its design. It was flawed from inception. It was a political compromise. It failed to implement 44 of the 48 globally accepted hallmarks of success. It offered amnesty rather than legal accountability. Its recommendations were ignored or underfunded, and therefore points to an inherent flaw in the implementation process. Most importantly, South Africa remains, to this day, deeply unequal, and victims remain distressed and disadvantaged, adjudicators, members of the public. It does not matter what side proposition wants to fabricate at this point. Past and present dictate that the South African Truth and Reconciliation process is a worldwide example of all things to be avoided, not replicated. The South African Truth and Reconciliation process is a cautionary tale, not an effective reparatory justice model. Thank you.
We thank the reply speaker and side opposition for closing out the debate in fiery style on that side of the House. And now we invite from side proposition the reply speaker to close out the debate in likewise manner in totality. Hear, hear.
We have heard from the opposition. We've heard what they had to say. But let us remind ourselves of the facts, what truth is, what actually pertained, what we have come to know as being factual. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a groundbreaking restorative justice body established to help heal the country after apartheid ended. What was Nelson Mandela's thinking at the time of the establishment of the TRC? Here is a man who was unjustly imprisoned for almost 30 years. However, when he was released, he held no grudge and forgave his oppressors. This allowed healing to flow for himself, his family, the African nation, and indeed the world. Reconciliation followed because truth was made known. The Bible itself teaches, we shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So let's remind ourselves of the facts and details. The TRC was established in 1995. It had a mandated period that covered human, politically related violations which occurred between March 1960 and May 94. It was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, with submissions being made in 1998 of October, followed by those in 2003. What were the purpose and objectives? Establish a complete as picture as possible of the causes, nature, and extent of the gross violations of human rights which were committed. Facilitate the granting of amnesty to persons who made full disclosure of all the relevant facts relating to the acts associated with a political objective. Establishing and making known the fate or whereabouts of victims and restoring human and civil dignity. and compiling a report providing a comprehensive account as possible of the activities and findings of the Commission. There are 3 committees, and we know them: Human Rights, Amnesty, and Reparation and Rehabilitation of Victims Committees. The outcomes we have clearly established. Over 22,000 victim statements were collected. There are over 7,000 amnesty applications that were received, 1,200 of which were granted. It focused on crimes committed by both apartheid-era government forces and the liberation movement. There are some principles of the impact based on restorative rather than retributive justice. That's critical. It emphasized truth-telling and forgiveness over punishment. It is credited with helping South Africa avoid civil conflict and build a more inclusive democracy. What would we rather? The bloodshed or the healing that the TRP brought about? Clearly, the TRP was not about money. There are no perfect or flawless systems. We are imperfect people living in an imperfect world. Notwithstanding, the TRP brought about healing. It was established for a purpose and achieved its objectives. That's what makes it an effective model worthy of emulation. In my own experience, I bring to bear on this. I hold this newspaper clipping from The Observer. My own daughter, 5 years ago, was shot in her head. But as a result of the forgiveness, we were able to come out with healing and feeling that healing. The TRP remains one of the most significant examples of transitional justice and a model for dealing with historical injustice through dialogue, truth, and national healing. I thank you.
All right, so we thank the proposition reply speaker for his submissions, and we invite Aninki.
Thank you very much, teams. Another round of applause for the teams. They certainly delivered well on that Moot. And just to remind those of you who are very excited on our social media platform, the Moot, be it resolved that South Africa's truth and reconciliation process was an effective model for reparatory justice. And the teams debated that Moot, we had PICA as team proponent and TPDCO as team opponent. And I'm sure the judges have a task on hand, which is to deliberate and then advise us after that deliberation, the winners of this match. For those of you who are storming up the conversation on YouTube, continue to keep the conversation going. We have just a few minutes while we wait on the judges' deliberation, so stay tuned. Thank you very much, teams.